Rain hammered the cobblestones as Alina Whitmore was pushed out of the side door of Ashford Manor, her small bag thrown after her like garbage. The door slammed shut before she could even turn around. She stood there, soaked within seconds, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Behind her, through the thick oak door, she could hear Lady Priscilla's voice, sharp and satisfied, telling the other servants that the matter was finally settled. Alina did not understand what she had done wrong. Just hours earlier, she had been folding linens in the east wing, humming a quiet tune, thinking about nothing more than the letter she planned to write to her sister that evening. Then 2 footmen had come for her without warning, gripping her arms as if she were a criminal, marching her down the servant stairs while the housekeeper read from a paper that accused her of shameful behavior with the Duke himself. She had tried to speak. She had tried to explain that nothing improper had happened between her and Duke Alaric Ashford, that their meeting in the garden the night before had been nothing more than 2 people standing beneath the same moon, exchanging a few nervous words. But no one wanted to hear her. The decision had already been made long before she opened her mouth. Now she stood in the rain, alone, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The manor gates loomed behind her, tall and iron and final, like the closing of a chapter she never got to finish reading. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and began to walk, though she did not know where her feet were taking her. All she knew was that she could not stay near that house a moment longer, not with the shame burning in her chest and the stares of the staff still fresh in her mind. She thought of her mother, long gone now, and the promise she had made to her before she died. Alina had promised she would always hold her head high, no matter what life threw at her. Walking through the storm with mud soaking into her boots, she tried to remember that promise, tried to let it steady her. But it was hard to hold her head high when everything she believed about her place in the world had just been torn away in a single afternoon. She had come to Ashford Manor 2 years ago, a quiet young woman with steady hands and a gentle voice, hired to serve as companion to Lady Priscilla. It had not been an easy position. Priscilla was demanding, cold, and quick to find fault, but Alina had done her best, and slowly she had built a small, careful life within those grand walls. She had her own room, modest but warm. She had a routine. She had begun, without even realizing it, to feel something like belonging. And then there had been the evenings in the garden. It had started by accident. Alina had gone out one night to clear her head after a particularly difficult day with Priscilla, walking along the stone paths lined with roses that bloomed even in the cooler months. She had not expected to find the Duke there, standing near the old fountain, looking up at the stars as though searching for an answer to a question he had not yet spoken aloud. They had talked, just talked, about small things at first, the weather, the roses, an old book he had been reading, but something about those conversations had felt different from anything else in her life at the manor. Duke Alaric did not speak to her the way others did, with that careful distance reserved for servants. He spoke to her as though her thoughts mattered, as though she were simply a person and nothing less. Those garden meetings became a quiet secret between them, though never anything Alina would have called scandalous. A few minutes here and there, stolen beneath the stars, when the house had gone quiet and the halls were empty. She told herself it meant nothing, that a man of his standing could never truly see a companion like her as anything more than a passing distraction. But some nights, walking back to her room with her heart beating a little faster than usual, she wondered if she was wrong. Now, walking through the rain with nothing but a small bag and the clothes on her back, she wondered if those meetings had been her undoing after all. Someone must have seen them. Someone must have twisted those quiet conversations into something dark and shameful, something worthy of dismissal without even a chance to defend herself. She reached the end of the long drive and looked back once at the manor, its windows glowing warm and gold against the gray storm, as if nothing inside those walls had changed at all. As if her entire world had not just been shattered while theirs continued exactly as before. She wiped at her eyes, though it was hard to tell if it was rain or tears sliding down her cheeks, and turned toward the road that led to the city. She had no family left to return to. Her sister had married and moved far to the north, and letters between them had grown rare over the years. Her small savings, tucked into the lining of her bag, would only last so long. She did not know where she would sleep that night, or the night after, or how she would explain to anyone who asked why she had left her position at one of the finest houses in the county. The walk to the city took hours. By the time she reached the outskirts, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and the gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life along the main road. She found a small inn near the edge of the market district, the kind of place that did not ask too many questions if a guest could pay for a single night. The innkeeper, an older woman with tired eyes, looked her over once, taking in her soaked dress and hollow expression, but said nothing beyond the price of the room. That first night, Alina sat on the narrow bed in the small, dim room, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She kept replaying the moment the footman had come for her, the accusing words of the housekeeper, the cold satisfaction in Lady Priscilla's voice. She could not understand why Priscilla would want her gone so badly, unless there was something more behind it than simple dislike. She thought, too, of Duke Alaric. Did he know what had happened to her? Had he been told the same lies that had been used to justify her dismissal? Or had he simply gone about his day, unaware that the woman he spoke with beneath the stars had been thrown out into the storm without so much as a chance to say goodbye? Part of her wanted to believe he would come looking for her, that he would hear what had happened and demand answers. But another part of her, the part shaped by years of watching how the world truly worked, told her not to hope for such things. Men of his position rarely chased after companions who disappeared from their households. There were always more important matters to attend to, more suitable women to consider for a future duchess. Whatever she had imagined blooming between them in those quiet garden evenings had likely been nothing more than her own foolish wishing. She did not sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the iron gates of Ashford Manor closing behind her, final and unyielding. When morning came, gray and damp, she counted the coins in her bag and realized she would need to find work quickly if she hoped to survive more than a week in the city. She spent the following days walking from shop to shop, asking about any position available, no matter how small. Most doors closed before she could finish speaking. A young woman with no references and no family in the city was not an easy person to hire, especially not one who flinched slightly whenever asked why she had left her last position. She learned quickly to give vague answers, to say only that circumstances had changed, and to change the subject as soon as she could. On the fourth day, exhausted and running low on coin, she found herself standing outside a small dress shop tucked between a bakery and a bookseller. The window displayed a modest but neatly arranged collection of gowns, and a handwritten sign in the corner announced that help was needed. Alina stood there for a long moment, gathering her courage, before pushing open the door. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped inside. The shop smelled of fabric and lavender, and rows of dresses hung along the walls in careful order. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, observant eyes, who looked up at Alina with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply assessing. Alina introduced herself using only her first name, leaving out the details of where she had come from. She explained that she had experience with needlework, learned from her mother years ago, and that she was looking for honest work. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, studied her for a long moment before asking her to demonstrate her skill with a needle and thread. Alina's hands, though trembling slightly from hunger and exhaustion, moved with practiced precision. She had always found comfort in needlework, a quiet, steady task that required nothing but focus and patience. Margaret watched closely as Alina finished a small hem, checking the stitches carefully before nodding once, almost to herself. It was not much of a position, and the pay was modest, but it was something. A place to work during the day, and Margaret even offered a small room above the shop where Alina could stay in exchange for a portion of her wages. Alina accepted before Margaret had even finished explaining the terms, relief washing over her so suddenly that she had to blink back tears. That evening, sitting in the small room above the shop with its narrow bed and single window looking out over the busy street below, Alina allowed herself, for the first time since leaving the manor, to breathe a little easier. She still did not understand why she had been cast out so suddenly, or what had truly happened behind those closed doors after her departure. But she had survived the first difficult days, and she had found, however humble, a place to begin again. She thought of Duke Alaric one last time before sleep finally took her that night. She wondered if he ever thought of her at all, or if she had already become nothing more than a forgotten name among the many people who passed briefly through the halls of his grand estate. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she would build a new life here, far from Ashford Manor, far from the shattered pieces of whatever she had once hoped might grow between them. She did not know, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, that back at Ashford Manor, Duke Alaric had returned from a 2-day journey to visit his solicitor, carrying with him a signed marriage contract bearing her name, only to be told that the young woman he intended to marry had vanished without a trace, dismissed on accusations he had never approved and would never have believed. She did not know that even as she lay in a stranger's shop above narrow streets she had never walked before, a duke was standing in his study, staring at a blank space on his desk where her letters of reference should have been, demanding answers from a staff too frightened of his sister to give him the truth. All Alina knew in that quiet, unfamiliar room was that her old life was gone, and a new one, however uncertain, had already begun. Duke Alaric Ashford stepped down from his carriage with the confidence of a man whose future had just been settled. 2 days on the road to visit his solicitor in the capital had left him tired, but the folded paper tucked inside his coat pocket made every hour of the journey worth it. He had signed a marriage contract, the first document of its kind he had ever put his name to, and the woman named on that paper was not chosen for her family's wealth or her connections to some distant title. She had been chosen because, for the first time in his life, he had met someone who spoke to him as though he were simply a man, and not a title to be managed or a fortune to be secured. He climbed the front steps of Ashford Manor with a lightness in his chest that surprised even him. He had planned everything carefully. He would find Alina that evening, ask his housekeeper to send word for her to meet him in the small parlor near the library, and there, away from the watchful eyes of the household, he would finally tell her what he had been too nervous to say beneath the stars 2 nights before. He had rehearsed the words more times than he cared to admit, turning them over in his mind during the long carriage ride, wondering if she would laugh at him for his nervousness, or simply stare at him in stunned silence. He handed his coat to the waiting footman and asked, almost casually, for Alina to be sent for. The footman's hesitation was so brief that Alaric nearly missed it, but something in the young man's expression made him pause. He asked again, more firmly this time, and the footman's eyes darted toward the staircase, toward the 2nd floor where Lady Priscilla's chambers were located, before he finally spoke. Alina, the footman explained carefully, no longer worked at the manor. She had been dismissed 4 days earlier, on the very morning after the Duke had left for the capital. For a long moment, Alaric simply stood there, certain he had misheard. He asked the footman to repeat himself, and when the young man did, stumbling now over his words, something cold and sharp settled into Alaric's chest. He demanded to know who had given the order, and the footman, clearly torn between loyalty to the household and fear of his employer's growing anger, finally admitted that the dismissal had come from Lady Priscilla herself, backed by claims of improper conduct between Alina and the Duke. Alaric felt the folded contract in his pocket as though it had suddenly grown heavier. Improper conduct. The word struck him like a blow. There had been nothing improper about those quiet evenings in the garden, nothing beyond 2 people slowly discovering that they wanted to know each other better. He had been careful, respectful, never once overstepping the boundaries that propriety demanded, even as his heart had begun to want more than propriety allowed. He asked where Alina had gone, and the footman only shook his head, explaining that she had left on foot, into the rain, with nothing but a small bag of her belongings. No one had thought to ask where she intended to go. No one, it seemed, had cared enough to ask. Something in Alaric's expression must have frightened the household, because within minutes, every servant seemed to find urgent business elsewhere, leaving the front hall unusually empty as he stood there, staring at the staircase his sister had descended so many times with that same knowing, satisfied look he now understood far too well. He found Priscilla in the drawing room, seated near the window with a cup of tea in her hands, looking as composed as ever. She did not even glance up when he entered, though the tightness around her mouth suggested she had been expecting this confrontation for days. He asked her directly what she had done, and for a moment Priscilla considered denying any involvement at all. But something in her brother's expression, a fury she had rarely seen from him, made her set down her teacup instead and finally meet his eyes. She explained, with a coldness that made Alaric's stomach turn, that she had done what was necessary to protect the family name. A companion, she said, was not a suitable match for a duke, no matter how pleasant her conversation or how gentle her manner. She had seen the way he looked at Alina in recent weeks, had heard whispers among the staff about their evening walks in the garden, and had decided without consulting him that the situation needed to be handled before it went any further. Alaric asked her, his voice dangerously quiet, exactly how she had handled it. Priscilla admitted, almost proudly, that she had instructed a maid to spread word among the staff of impropriety between Alina and the Duke, knowing that such rumors, once whispered in the right ears, would be enough to justify a swift dismissal without requiring any actual proof. She had forged the necessary paperwork herself, using her authority as lady of the house in her brother's absence to ensure the matter was concluded before he returned. For a long moment, Alaric said nothing at all. He simply stared at his sister, trying to reconcile the woman sitting before him with the sister he had grown up beside, the sister he had trusted to manage the household in his absence. He had known Priscilla could be difficult, cold even, but he had never imagined she was capable of something so deliberately cruel. He told her, in a voice that left no room for argument, that Alina had been the woman he intended to marry. He watched the color drain from Priscilla's face as he pulled the folded contract from his coat pocket and set it on the table between them, the ink still fresh, his signature already binding him to a woman who no longer had a roof over her head because of what his own sister had done. Priscilla's composure finally cracked. She stammered something about not knowing, about only trying to protect him from a mistake she believed he would come to regret, but Alaric was no longer listening. He gathered the contract, folded it carefully back into his pocket, and left the room without another word, leaving his sister alone with the weight of what she had done. He spent the rest of that evening questioning every member of the staff he could find, piecing together what little information they had about Alina's departure. She had left on foot in the rain, sometime in the early afternoon 4 days earlier. No carriage had been called for her. No one had offered to help her carry her single small bag through the storm. She had simply walked out through the gates and disappeared into the gray afternoon, alone. Alaric barely slept that night. He lay awake in his chambers, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation he and Alina had shared in the garden, searching his memory for any clue about where she might have gone. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she had a sister living somewhere to the north, though she had never given a specific location. She had mentioned, too, a fondness for the city, for its noise and its energy, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of the countryside estate. By morning, he had made a decision. He would find her, no matter how long it took or how far he had to search. He requested his fastest horse and rode out toward the city himself, ignoring the concerned protests of his household staff, who worried about a duke traveling alone and unannounced. The city, when he reached it, felt impossibly vast. Streets branched in every direction, crowded with carts and pedestrians and the constant noise of a place that never seemed to rest. Alaric had visited the city many times before for business and social obligations, but he had never once had to search for a single person among its endless streets and hidden corners. He began at the inns nearest the main road, the ones most likely to take in a traveler arriving on foot in the rain. He described Alina carefully to every innkeeper he spoke with, her dark hair, her quiet, steady manner, the way she carried herself even in difficult circumstances with a dignity that seemed almost out of place in her humble position. Most innkeepers shook their heads, unable to recall any guest matching her description. A few remembered someone similar, but could offer no further information about where she might have gone afterward. Days turned into weeks. Alaric returned to Ashford Manor only briefly between searches, refusing every social invitation his family attempted to arrange, ignoring the increasingly pointed suggestions from distant relatives about suitable young women he ought to consider for marriage. He had already made his choice, long before any of them had the chance to offer their opinions, and he was not about to abandon that choice simply because circumstances had made it more difficult than expected. Priscilla, for her part, grew increasingly quiet in the weeks following their confrontation. She no longer offered opinions on household matters, no longer attempted to steer conversations toward more suitable candidates for her brother's affections. Whether her silence came from genuine remorse or simple fear of further consequences, Alaric could not say, and he found he did not particularly care. His attention was consumed entirely by the search for Alina, by the growing fear that he might never find her at all. He hired a man familiar with the city's many districts, someone who knew how to ask questions in places a duke could not easily go himself, places where a woman without family or references might find shelter or work. The man returned with small pieces of information here and there, rumors of a young woman matching Alina's description seen in various parts of the city, though none of the leads amounted to anything solid. Meanwhile, in the small room above Margaret's dress shop, Alina had begun to settle slowly into her new routine. She rose early each morning to help open the shop, spent her days assisting customers and mending garments with careful, practiced stitches, and retired each evening to her narrow bed, exhausted but grateful for the steady rhythm her new life had begun to offer. She had told Margaret only the barest details of her past, allowing the older woman to believe she had simply left a difficult household position in search of better circumstances. Margaret, though sharp-eyed and clearly curious, did not press for more information than Alina was willing to give, and for that, Alina was deeply grateful. She thought of Duke Alaric less often now, though he still crossed her mind in quiet moments, usually late at night when the shop had gone dark and silent around her. She wondered sometimes if he had ever learned the truth about her dismissal, or if he simply believed whatever story Lady Priscilla had constructed to explain her sudden absence. She told herself it did not matter either way. Whatever future she had imagined during those quiet garden conversations belonged to a life she no longer had access to, a life that had closed its doors to her the moment she stepped out into the rain. She did not know that the man she had tried so hard to forget was, at that very moment, standing in a crowded market district only a few streets away, showing a small, hand-drawn sketch of her face to anyone willing to look at it, refusing to give up the search no matter how many weeks passed or how many dead ends he encountered. She did not know how close he had already come. 6 weeks had passed since Alina arrived in the city, and the season had begun to shift from the last damp days of autumn into the sharper cold of early winter. She had grown used to the rhythm of her days at the dress shop, the steady clip of scissors through fabric, the soft murmur of customers discussing hemlines and colors, the quiet satisfaction of watching a finished gown leave the shop on someone who felt beautiful wearing it. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, but it was honest work, and honest work had a way of steadying a person's heart even when everything else in their world had been turned upside down. Margaret had grown fond of her in those weeks, in the careful, undemonstrative way of a woman who had learned long ago not to give her trust easily. She began leaving Alina in charge of the shop for short periods while she attended to errands, a small gesture that meant more to Alina than Margaret likely realized. It was the first time since leaving Ashford Manor that anyone had shown her real trust, and she found herself working even harder to prove it had been well placed. But the city, for all its noise and distraction, was smaller than Alina had first believed. Word traveled quickly through its streets and shops, carried by customers who moved between districts, by deliveries that crossed from one side of the city to the other, by the endless chatter of people who thrived on knowing everyone else's business. Alina had not considered, in those first desperate days of finding shelter and work, that the very anonymity she sought might not last as long as she needed it to. It began with a customer. A well-dressed woman had come into the shop one afternoon, seeking alterations for a gown she intended to wear to a gathering that weekend. As Alina knelt to pin the hem, the woman studied her with an expression that shifted slowly from polite disinterest to something sharper, more focused. She asked, in a tone that pretended casualness but carried a clear edge of curiosity, whether Alina had once worked at Ashford Manor. Alina's hands stilled for only a moment before she resumed her work, keeping her voice carefully even as she said she was not familiar with the name. The woman did not seem entirely convinced, but she let the matter drop, and Alina told herself it was nothing more than a passing coincidence, a resemblance to someone else the woman had once known. But the encounter left her unsettled for days afterward. She found herself glancing more carefully at customers who entered the shop, watching for any flicker of recognition in their eyes, any hint that her carefully constructed new life might unravel at the mention of a single name. She began taking longer routes home from errands, avoiding the busier streets where she was more likely to be noticed, though she could not have said exactly what she feared would happen if someone from her old life did recognize her. Perhaps, she told herself late one night as she lay awake listening to the wind outside her window, she feared not danger exactly, but the return of hope. Hope had already betrayed her once. She was not eager to let it back into her heart only to have it torn away a second time. What she did not know was that the well-dressed woman in the shop had, in fact, recognized her correctly, and had mentioned the encounter almost in passing to an acquaintance a few days later, a woman who happened to know a member of Ashford Manor's staff. That small, seemingly unimportant piece of gossip began traveling through the city's social circles, moving from one conversation to another, drawing steadily closer to the one man who had been searching desperately for exactly this kind of information. Meanwhile, Alaric's search had grown more focused, if no less exhausting. He had narrowed his efforts to the working-class districts near the market, following the scattered leads his hired investigator had gathered over the previous weeks. He spent his days walking streets he had never before had reason to visit, speaking with shopkeepers and innkeepers and delivery men, showing them the small sketch he had commissioned of Alina's likeness, drawn from memory by an artist he trusted to keep the matter private. Most people shook their heads at the sketch, unable to place the face among the countless strangers who passed through their establishments each day. But occasionally, someone would pause, studying the drawing a moment longer than the others had, and Alaric would feel a brief, fragile spark of hope flare in his chest, only to have it extinguished when the person could offer nothing more definite than a vague sense of familiarity. He had begun to wonder, in his more exhausted moments, whether he would ever find her at all. The city was vast, and people who wished to disappear within it often succeeded, especially those with good reason to avoid being found. He wondered, too, whether Alina even wanted to be found, whether she had heard some version of the events at Ashford Manor that painted him as complicit in her dismissal, as someone who had simply allowed her to be cast out without protest. The thought troubled him more than almost anything else. He could bear the physical exhaustion of endless searching, the frustration of dead ends and false leads, but he could not bear the idea that Alina might believe he had abandoned her, that she might be somewhere in this vast city, nursing a wound made deeper by the belief that he had never truly cared for her at all. It was during this difficult stretch of the search that Priscilla, still burdened by guilt she had not fully admitted even to herself, approached her brother with information she had gathered quietly over the past several days. She had heard, through a distant connection among her social circle, a small rumor about a young woman working in a dress shop near the market district who had once been mistaken for a former servant of Ashford Manor. Alaric listened carefully as his sister relayed the details, torn between renewed hope and lingering anger at the role she had played in creating this entire painful situation in the first place. He asked her, his voice still carrying an edge of coldness he had not fully released since their confrontation weeks earlier, why she had chosen to share this information now, after everything that had happened. Priscilla, to her credit, did not offer excuses. She simply said that she had watched her brother grow steadily more withdrawn and exhausted over the past weeks, that she understood, finally and completely, the depth of what she had taken from him, and that she wanted, in whatever small way remained possible, to help make it right. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Alaric took the information to his hired investigator that same afternoon, and within 2 days, the man had identified the dress shop in question, tucked between a bakery and a bookseller on a quiet street not far from the market square. Alaric's heart pounded as he received the news, torn between the urge to ride there immediately and the fear that this lead, like so many before it, would prove to be nothing more than another disappointment. He decided, after a long night of careful consideration, that he would not rush the matter. If Alina truly was working in that shop, he did not want to frighten her with a sudden, dramatic appearance that might only confirm whatever fears she carried about being pursued or judged. He would approach carefully, quietly, giving her the chance to see him on her own terms rather than being ambushed by his sudden presence. He spent an entire day simply observing the shop from a discreet distance, watching the steady flow of customers moving in and out through its narrow door. On the second day, just as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, he saw her. She stepped out of the shop's side entrance, a small basket in hand, likely on her way to run some errand before the day's end. Her hair was pulled back simply, her dress plain but neat, nothing like the modest but well-kept clothing she had worn during her time at the manor, yet unmistakably, unquestionably her. Alaric felt something break open in his chest at the sight of her, a mixture of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees, and a fresh wave of guilt for every day she had spent believing herself abandoned. He did not approach her that evening. He told himself it was because he wanted to plan his words carefully, to make certain that, when he finally spoke to her, he would say exactly what needed to be said. But in truth, he was afraid. Afraid that after everything that had happened, after weeks of searching and hoping, she might look at him and see not the man who loved her, but simply another reminder of the life that had cast her aside. He returned to his temporary lodgings in the city that night and spent hours composing and discarding letter after letter, trying to find the right words to explain everything that had happened since the morning she was dismissed. In the end, he decided that no letter could truly convey what needed to be said. He would have to speak to her in person, and he would have to be prepared for the possibility that she might not want to hear anything he had to say at all. The following morning, fate intervened in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Margaret had received an order from a wealthy household requesting alterations to several gowns before an upcoming gathering, work that needed to be delivered personally to ensure the fittings were correct. Margaret, occupied with another pressing matter that morning, asked Alina to make the delivery herself, providing her with the address and detailed instructions for the fitting. Alina had no way of knowing, as she gathered the carefully wrapped garments and set out toward the address Margaret had given her, that the household in question was Ashford Manor itself, and that within the hour, she would be standing once again inside the very walls she had been so cruelly cast out of weeks before. Alina did not recognize the address at first. Margaret had scrawled it quickly on a scrap of paper before rushing off to handle her own errands, and Alina had been too focused on balancing the carefully wrapped gowns in her arms to pay much attention to the street names as she made her way through the city. It was only when the carriage house came into view, tall and familiar against the gray morning sky, that her steps slowed and her stomach dropped with sudden, sick recognition. Ashford Manor. For a moment, she considered turning back entirely, inventing some excuse to give Margaret about a missed delivery or a wrong address. But the gowns in her arms represented real income for the shop, income Margaret depended on to keep her small business running through the leaner winter months. Alina could not simply abandon the task because of her own fear. She took a slow, steadying breath, adjusted the bundle in her arms, and forced her feet to carry her toward the servant's entrance she remembered so painfully well. Her heart pounded with every step up the familiar path. She kept her head low, her simple bonnet pulled forward to shadow her face, praying that whoever answered the door would be someone unfamiliar, someone who had joined the household staff after her own abrupt departure. The odds, she told herself, were reasonably good. Households like this one saw constant turnover among the lower staff positions. The door opened, and relief flooded through her when an unfamiliar young maid greeted her, taking the bundle of gowns with polite disinterest, and directing her to wait in a small receiving room near the servants' quarters while someone confirmed the fitting arrangements. Alina stepped inside, grateful for the dim lighting of the narrow hallway, and allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She should have known better than to relax so soon. The receiving room, as it turned out, sat only a short distance from the main household offices, close enough that Alina could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the walls as staff members moved about their morning duties. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible, counting the minutes until someone would return to confirm the delivery and send her on her way. Then she heard a voice she recognized instantly, and her blood ran cold. Lady Priscilla was speaking to someone in the hallway just outside, her tone carrying the same sharp, commanding quality Alina remembered all too well. Alina's entire body went rigid, every instinct screaming at her to find some way to disappear before Priscilla passed by the open doorway of the receiving room. She glanced around desperately, spotting a narrow gap between a tall wardrobe and the wall, and without fully thinking through her decision, she slipped into the shadow of the space, pressing herself against the wood, praying the darkness would be enough to hide her. The footsteps grew closer, and Alina held her breath, certain that at any moment the door would open fully, and she would be discovered, dragged before the same woman who had destroyed her life weeks earlier with nothing more than a fabricated rumor and a forged dismissal notice. But the footsteps passed by the doorway without pausing, Priscilla's voice fading as she continued down the hallway toward some other part of the house. Alina remained frozen in her hiding spot for several long moments afterward, her heart still racing, before she finally allowed herself to step back out into the open space of the small room, her hands trembling as she smoothed down her skirts. It was in that moment of shaken composure, as she attempted to steady her breathing and collect her scattered nerves, that the door opened again, and a different figure stepped into the room. It was not Priscilla. It was not the young maid returning to confirm the delivery. It was Duke Alaric Ashford himself, having heard from a passing servant that a delivery had arrived from a dress shop near the market district, a shop he had spent the previous evening watching from a discreet distance, hoping for exactly the kind of opportunity that now stood before him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alaric stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Alina's face as though he could not quite believe what he was seeing, despite having watched her from across the street only the day before. Alina, for her part, felt every carefully constructed defense she had built over the past weeks crumble instantly at the sight of him, replaced by a confusing tangle of relief, fear, and something else entirely, something she had tried desperately to convince herself she no longer felt. It was Alaric who spoke first, his voice rough with an emotion he did not bother trying to hide. He said her name, just her name, nothing more, but the way he said it carried weeks of searching, weeks of worry, weeks of a grief he had not allowed himself to fully name until this very moment when the object of that grief stood alive and well before him. Alina took a step back instinctively, her mind racing through a dozen possible explanations for his sudden appearance, none of which made any sense given everything she had assumed about her dismissal in the weeks since it happened. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, why he was looking at her as though he had seen a ghost. Alaric took a careful step forward, close enough now that Alina could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the same weariness that came from weeks of relentless, unforgiving worry. He explained, in halting, urgent sentences, that he had been searching for her since the very day he returned from the capital to discover she had been dismissed in his absence, that he had spent every week since combing through the city, following rumor after rumor, refusing to accept that she had simply vanished without a trace. Alina listened, her mind struggling to reconcile his words with the story she had told herself in the weeks since her dismissal, the story where the Duke had either known and allowed her departure or simply never noticed her absence at all amid the demands of his household and his position. She asked him, her voice trembling now, why he had been searching for her at all, What possible reason a duke could have for chasing after a former companion dismissed for improper conduct? At those words, something shifted in Alaric's expression. A flash of anger that Alina quickly realized was not directed at her, but at the very accusation itself. He told her, firmly and clearly, that there had been no improper conduct, that the accusation had been a fabrication designed to force her out of the household before he could act on feelings he had been slowly, carefully building toward acting on for weeks. Before Alina could fully process what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway outside sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She glanced toward the door, her earlier fear of discovery returning in full force, and Alaric, noticing her sudden tension, understood immediately what she feared. He assured her, his voice low and urgent, that whoever approached would not harm her, that he would not allow it. But Alina's instincts, sharpened by weeks of hiding and careful avoidance, screamed at her to leave before the situation grew any more complicated than it already was. She gathered the folds of her skirt, murmured a hurried apology, and slipped past him toward the door before he could stop her, disappearing back down the servants' corridor and out into the street beyond, leaving Alaric standing alone in the small receiving room, stunned by how quickly the reunion he had spent weeks hoping for had slipped through his fingers. He called after her, his voice echoing down the empty hallway, but by the time he reached the servants' entrance himself, she had already vanished into the crowded street beyond, swallowed once again by the vast, indifferent city that had hidden her so effectively for the past 6 weeks. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, torn between frustration at losing her so quickly and a fierce, renewed determination that burned brighter than ever before. He knew now, with absolute certainty, exactly which shop she worked at. He knew the general area where she lived. The search that had once felt impossibly vast now narrowed to a manageable, achievable distance, and he was not about to let a moment of fear or confusion undo weeks of careful, determined effort. But as he turned back into the house, already planning his next move, he did not yet know that Alina, shaken and terrified by the sudden encounter, had made a decision of her own during her hurried walk back toward Margaret's shop, a decision that would complicate his search far more than he could have anticipated. She had decided she could not stay in the city any longer. The risk of discovery, she told herself as she hurried through the crowded streets with her heart still pounding, had grown too great. If Duke Alaric had found her once, through nothing more than a coincidental delivery, he could find her again, and the confusion and fear that encounter had stirred within her felt like more than she could bear to face a second time. She needed distance. She needed time to understand her own feelings before she could trust herself to face him again, if she ever chose to face him at all. By the time she reached the shop, breathless and pale, Margaret took one look at her and immediately set aside whatever task she had been working on, guiding Alina to a chair near the back room and asking, with genuine concern, what had happened during the delivery. Alina, unable to hold back the flood of emotion any longer, told Margaret everything. The dismissal, the accusations, the weeks of hiding, and finally, the unexpected encounter with Duke Alaric himself, standing before her as though he had been searching for her all along. Margaret listened without interruption, her sharp eyes softening with understanding as the story unfolded, piece by piece, revealing far more about her young employee's past than Alina had ever intended to share. When Alina finally finished, exhausted and drained by the telling, Margaret was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told Alina, gently but firmly, that running from the truth rarely solved anything, that if this Duke truly cared for her as much as the encounter suggested, hiding from him would only prolong the pain for both of them. But she also understood, better than most, the fear that came from trusting someone after being so thoroughly betrayed by circumstances beyond one's control. She left the decision entirely in Alina's hands, offering only her support, whatever choice Alina ultimately made. And Alina, sitting in the quiet back room of the shop that had become the closest thing to a home she had known in weeks, found herself facing a decision far more difficult than any she had encountered since the day she was cast out into the rain. Alina did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed above the shop, staring at the ceiling, turning the day's events over and over in her mind until they blurred together into an exhausting tangle of fear and longing. She kept returning to the moment Alaric had said her name, the raw urgency in his voice, the exhaustion written so plainly across his features. It did not match the story she had told herself in the weeks since her dismissal, the story where she had simply been an inconvenience easily forgotten once she was out of sight. But stories, she reminded herself firmly, were easier to trust than people. People could disappoint you. People could change their minds, could bow to family pressure or social expectation, could decide in a quiet, private moment that the risk of scandal outweighed whatever affection they had once felt. She had already lost everything once because of assumptions she had made about her place in his world. She was not eager to make the same mistake twice. By the time morning light filtered through her small window, she had made her decision. She would write to her sister, request permission to stay with her family in the north, and use what little savings she had accumulated to purchase passage on the next available coach heading in that direction. It was not a decision made from courage, she admitted to herself as she packed her few belongings into the same small bag she had carried out of Ashford Manor weeks before. It was a decision made from fear, plain and simple, but she told herself that survival sometimes required choosing safety over uncertainty, no matter how much her heart protested the choice. She explained her plans to Margaret over breakfast, watching the older woman's expression carefully for any sign of judgment or disappointment. Margaret listened quietly, her sharp eyes studying Alina's face for a long moment before she finally spoke, telling her only that she understood the impulse to run from difficult feelings, but that she hoped Alina would think carefully before making such a permanent decision based on fear alone. Alina thanked her for her kindness, for the shelter and work she had provided during the most difficult weeks of her life, and promised to write once she had settled with her sister. Margaret embraced her briefly, an unusual gesture from a woman typically so reserved, and wished her safe travels, though the concern in her eyes remained even as she said her goodbyes. The coach to the north departed from the main station at midday, and Alina arrived with nearly an hour to spare, her small bag clutched tightly against her chest as she waited among the crowd of other travelers gathered on the platform. She kept glancing toward the entrance of the station, some small, foolish part of her half expecting, half hoping that Alaric might appear, might somehow know where to find her and arrive in time to change her mind. But the minutes ticked past, and no familiar figure appeared among the crowd, and Alina told herself firmly that this was exactly the outcome she should have expected. Whatever urgency had driven him to search for her over the past weeks had likely already faded, replaced by the countless other demands of his position and household. She had been foolish to imagine, even for a moment, that a duke would chase after a coach bound for the northern countryside, simply because a former companion had slipped through his fingers once again. When the coach finally began boarding, Alina took her seat near the window, watching the familiar city streets begin to fade behind her as the horses pulled the coach steadily northward. She told herself she felt relief, that this was the sensible choice, the choice that would finally allow her to build a life free from the constant fear of discovery and the painful uncertainty of feelings she could not fully trust. But the tightness in her chest as the city disappeared from view felt like anything but relief. Meanwhile, Alaric had returned to the dress shop that very morning, his heart pounding with anticipation as he approached the familiar door between the bakery and the bookseller. He had spent the previous evening carefully composing the words he intended to say, determined this time not to let fear or confusion cost him the chance to explain everything properly, to finally offer Alina the truth she deserved after weeks of painful, unnecessary separation. But when he stepped inside the shop, it was Margaret who greeted him, not Alina, and the older woman's expression carried a weight that immediately told him something had gone wrong. She explained, with visible reluctance, that Alina had left the city that very morning, bound for the northern countryside to stay with her sister, frightened by yesterday's encounter into believing that leaving entirely was her only remaining option. Alaric felt the news land like a physical blow. He asked, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency, exactly when the coach had departed, and Margaret, recognizing the desperate hope written across his features, told him the departure time without hesitation, adding only that the coach would be making its first scheduled stop at a waypost in roughly 3 hours' ride to the north. Alaric did not wait to hear anything more. He thanked Margaret hurriedly, promised to explain everything properly once he had found Alina, and rushed out of the shop toward the stables where his horse waited, his mind racing through calculations of distance and time, determined to reach that Waypost Inn before the coach continued onward to destinations even further from his reach. The ride was grueling. Alaric pushed his horse harder than he ever had before, weaving through the crowded streets of the city before finally reaching the open countryside road that led north, the same road the coach had taken hours earlier. He knew the odds were not entirely in his favor. A single rider, even on a fast horse, could not always outpace a coach with a significant head start, but he also knew the roads well enough to understand the coach would need to stop periodically to change horses and allow passengers a brief respite, and it was during one such stop that he hoped, desperately, to catch up. As he rode, his mind returned again and again to the conversation he had shared with his sister in the days following their painful confrontation. Priscilla had asked him once, her voice unusually subdued, why he was willing to go to such lengths for a woman he had known for such a relatively short time. He had struggled to find an answer that fully captured what he felt, settling eventually on the simple truth that Alina had made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, like a person rather than a title, and that such a feeling, once discovered, was not something he was willing to let slip away without a fight. He thought, too, of the marriage contract still folded carefully in his coat pocket, the ink long since dried, waiting patiently for the moment he could finally place it in Alina's hands and explain exactly what it meant. He had carried it with him every single day since his return from the capital, a constant reminder of the promise he had made to himself the moment he signed his name to that paper, long before he understood how much effort it would take to fulfill it. The countryside blurred past him as he rode, fields and hedgerows, and the occasional farmhouse marking the passage of miles beneath his horse's steady, exhausted pace. He pushed onward without rest, ignoring the ache building in his own muscles, focused entirely on reaching that Waypost Inn before the coach continued its journey northward. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon by the time the familiar shape of the Waypost Inn finally came into view, a modest stone building set back from the road, with a stable yard where several coaches stood already waiting for fresh horses to be readied. Alaric's heart pounded with a mixture of exhaustion and desperate hope as he approached, his eyes scanning the small crowd of travelers gathered near the inn's entrance, searching for one particular face among the strangers. He did not see her immediately, and for one terrible moment he feared he had arrived too late, that the coach carrying her had already continued its journey while he was still miles behind on the road. But then, near the edge of the stable yard, standing slightly apart from the other travelers with her small bag still clutched against her chest, he saw her. Alina had stepped away from the crowded inn to walk along the edge of the yard, needing a moment alone to gather her thoughts before the coach resumed its journey. She had not expected, in that quiet moment of solitude, to hear the sound of an approaching rider, urgent and hurried, drawing closer along the very road she had traveled that afternoon. She turned, more out of simple curiosity than any real expectation, and felt her entire body go still at the sight of Duke Alaric Ashford, exhausted and travel-worn, dismounting from his horse with an urgency that left no doubt about how far and how hard he had ridden to reach this place. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The stable yard around them continued its ordinary bustle, travelers calling to one another, horses being led to fresh water, the distant sound of a coach driver checking his harnesses, but between Alina and Alaric, the world seemed to narrow down to nothing but the space separating them, and the question of who would close it first. It was Alina who finally broke the silence, though her voice came out smaller than she intended, barely carrying across the distance between them. She asked how he had known where to find her, and Alaric, still catching his breath from the long, hard ride, explained that Margaret had told him everything the moment he arrived at the shop that morning, and that he had ridden without stopping the entire way, terrified he would arrive too late to say what needed to be said. Alina felt something inside her chest crack open at those words, the careful walls she had built over the past weeks beginning to crumble despite her best efforts to keep them standing. She asked him, her voice trembling now, why it mattered so much, why a duke would ride for hours without rest simply to catch up with a coach carrying a dismissed former companion toward the northern countryside. Alaric closed the remaining distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, but she remained still, watching him with an expression caught somewhere between fear and desperate hope. He reached into his coat and withdrew the folded contract he had carried with him every day since his return from the capital, holding it out toward her with hands that were not entirely steady. He explained, finally, everything he had been trying to tell her since their brief, interrupted encounter in the Manor's receiving room. He told her about the journey to the capital, about signing the marriage contract before he had even fully worked up the courage to propose to her properly, about returning home with every intention of asking for her hand only to discover she had been dismissed in his absence, cast out through no fault of her own, by a sister, desperate to protect a family reputation that Alaric no longer cared to protect at the expense of the woman he loved. Alina took the folded paper with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully to see her own name written there in careful, formal script, dated the very morning she had been thrown out into the rain. The truth of what he was telling her settled slowly over her, each piece falling into place with the weight of understanding she had not allowed herself to hope for during the long, lonely weeks since her dismissal. She asked him, her voice barely above a whisper now, why Lady Priscilla had done such a thing, and Alaric explained, with visible difficulty, his sister's belief that a companion was not a suitable match for a duke, her decision to fabricate accusations of impropriety and forge dismissal papers rather than allow her brother to make his own choice about his future. Alina felt tears finally spill over, weeks of accumulated grief and confusion and fear breaking free all at once as she stood there in the stable yard, the marriage contract clutched in her hands, the man who had signed it standing before her with an expression of such open, unguarded hope that it nearly undid her entirely. She asked him, needing to hear it spoken plainly despite everything the contract already told her, whether he truly wanted to marry her, not out of some sense of obligation created by an already signed document, but because he genuinely wanted her as his wife. Alaric reached out then, gently, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not, he cupped her face carefully in his hands, telling her that he had wanted nothing else since the very first evening they spoke beneath the stars in the Manor gardens, that every day of the past 6 weeks searching for her had only confirmed with absolute certainty exactly how much he wanted her in his life, not as an obligation, but as the woman he loved. The coach driver called out, announcing that the northbound coach would be departing shortly, and Alina felt the weight of the decision before her settle fully onto her shoulders. She could board that coach and continue toward her sister's home, toward the safe, quiet life she had planned for herself in the wake of her dismissal. Or she could stay here in the stable yard and choose the uncertain, complicated, but deeply longed for future that Alaric was offering her. She looked down at the marriage contract still clutched in her hands, at her own name written there in ink that had dried weeks ago, waiting patiently for this exact moment, and she made her decision. She told the coach driver, her voice steadier now than it had been in weeks, that she would not be continuing her journey after all. She retrieved her small bag from where it rested near the inn's entrance and turned back to Alaric, who watched her with an expression of such profound relief that it seemed to erase some of the exhaustion etched into his features from the long ride. They spoke for hours that evening, seated together in the quiet corner of the Waypost Inn's small dining room, sharing a simple meal while Alaric explained everything Alina had missed in the weeks since her dismissal. He told her about the confrontation with Priscilla, about his sister's slow, halting steps toward genuine remorse, about the small piece of information she had finally offered that led him to the dress shop where Alina had found refuge and honest work. Alina, in turn, told him about her own weeks in the city, about Margaret's quiet kindness, about the careful new life she had begun building for herself, even while carrying the weight of believing she had lost everything that mattered most. She told him, too, about the moment she recognized him in the Manor's receiving room, about the fear that had driven her to flee before he could explain anything, and about the long, sleepless night that followed as she wrestled with whether to trust the possibility of a future she had already convinced herself was impossible. By the time the innkeeper announced that rooms were available for the night, both of them exhausted from the day's events but unwilling to end the conversation entirely, Alaric arranged for separate, proper accommodations, determined that their reunion would be conducted with every measure of respectability, no matter how much his heart urged him to stay close to her side. The following morning, they began the journey back toward the city together, Alina riding in a hired carriage while Alaric rode alongside on his exhausted but faithful horse, both of them speaking easily now, the careful distance and uncertainty of the previous weeks finally beginning to dissolve into something warmer, something that felt, for the first time since her dismissal, like genuine hope for the future they had both been afraid to fully believe in. As the familiar shape of the city came into view on the horizon, Alina found herself thinking not of the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, but of everything still ahead of them. There would be difficult conversations still to have with Priscilla, with the wider social circles that would inevitably have opinions about a duke marrying a former companion with no family connections or fortune to offer. But for the first time since she had been pushed out into the rain weeks earlier, Alina felt something steady and certain settling into her chest, a quiet confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would not be facing them alone. The return to Ashford Manor was nothing like Alina's hurried, fearful visit only days earlier. This time, she arrived through the front entrance, seated beside Alaric in his own carriage, her hand held gently in his the entire ride from the city. Still, her nerves had not entirely settled, especially knowing that within these walls she would soon come face to face with the woman responsible for the accusations that had upended her life so completely. Alaric had sent word ahead, requesting that Priscilla wait for them in the drawing room, the same room where he had confronted her weeks earlier with the truth of what her actions had cost him. Alina took a steadying breath as the carriage came to a stop, and Alaric squeezed her hand gently, telling her she did not need to face this conversation alone, that whatever Priscilla had to say, he would be standing beside her the entire time. They found Priscilla waiting exactly where he had instructed, seated near the window with none of the cold composure she had displayed during their previous confrontation. Instead, she rose immediately upon seeing them enter together, her eyes moving quickly from her brother's face to Alina's, taking in the obvious warmth between them, the way their hands remained joined even as they crossed the threshold into the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Priscilla did something Alina had not expected at all. She crossed the room and with visible difficulty offered a genuine apology, her voice unsteady in a way that suggested real remorse rather than simple fear of consequence. She explained that in the weeks since her brother's confrontation, she had watched him grow increasingly withdrawn and exhausted, consumed entirely by a search she had caused through her own selfish desire to protect a family reputation that, she now understood, had never truly been in danger in the first place. She admitted that her true fear had never really been about propriety or suitability. It had been about losing her brother's attention and affection to someone else, a fear born from their own complicated family history and the distance that had grown between them since their parents' passing years earlier. She had convinced herself that removing Alina from the household would somehow preserve the close relationship she and Alaric had once shared, never fully considering the pain her actions would cause, or the possibility that her brother's happiness might depend on exactly the person she had worked so hard to remove. Alina listened to this explanation with a complicated mixture of emotions. She could understand, in some small way, the fear of losing someone important, having felt something similar herself during the long weeks of uncertainty following her dismissal. But understanding the motivation did not entirely erase the pain of what had actually happened, the humiliation of being cast out with no explanation, the terrifying uncertainty of finding herself alone and penniless in an unfamiliar city. She told Priscilla carefully but honestly that she appreciated the apology, but that trust, once broken so completely, would take time to rebuild. Priscilla nodded, accepting this without argument, and offered, somewhat awkwardly, to help however she could as Alina and Alaric moved forward with their plans, whatever those plans might ultimately look like. Alaric, watching this exchange with visible relief, finally spoke, explaining to his sister that he intended to marry Alina as soon as arrangements could reasonably be made, and that he expected the household, staff and family alike, to treat her with exactly the respect and dignity befitting the future Duchess of Ashford. Priscilla agreed without hesitation, and for the first time since Alina's dismissal, the atmosphere within the manor's walls felt lighter, freer of the tension and secrecy that had defined her final weeks there. In the days that followed, Alina found herself navigating an entirely new set of challenges, learning the responsibilities and expectations that would accompany her new position as Alaric's wife. She insisted on returning to the city briefly to properly thank Margaret for her kindness and to explain, in full, everything that had happened since her hurried departure weeks earlier. Margaret, though clearly moved by the news, simply smiled and told Alina she had known from the very first day that there was more to her story than she had initially shared, and that she was genuinely happy to see it resolved so well. Alaric insisted on properly compensating Margaret for the risk and kindness she had shown Alina during her most difficult weeks, an offer Margaret initially resisted before finally accepting with quiet gratitude, understanding it was as much a gesture of respect as it was practical assistance. Word of the upcoming marriage spread quickly through the social circles that had once whispered rumors about Alina's dismissal, though the story now circulating carried a very different tone than before. Some, predictably, questioned the wisdom of a duke marrying a woman with no family fortune or noble connections, but Alaric addressed these concerns directly and without apology whenever they arose, making it clear that his choice had been made with full knowledge and full conviction, and that anyone unwilling to respect his decision would find themselves unwelcome in his household going forward. Alina, for her part, found herself growing steadily more comfortable in her new role, aided significantly by Priscilla's genuine efforts to make amends. The two women, though never quite becoming close friends, developed a respectful working relationship as they navigated the preparations for the wedding together, Priscilla offering her knowledge of proper social customs and expectations, while Alina brought her own practical, grounded perspective to decisions that might otherwise have been dictated entirely by tradition and formality. As the wedding date approached, Alina often found herself thinking back to that terrible afternoon weeks earlier, standing in the rain outside the manor gates with nothing but a small bag of belongings and a shattered sense of who she was and where she belonged in the world. She had believed in that moment that her connection to Ashford Manor and everything it represented had ended entirely, that whatever brief happiness she had found in those quiet garden conversations belonged to a chapter of her life that had already closed. Instead, she had discovered something far more enduring than she could have imagined during those darkest days, a love that had survived deliberate sabotage, weeks of painful separation, and her own fear-driven attempt to flee entirely from the possibility of happiness. She understood now, standing on the threshold of a future she had never dared to fully hope for, that sometimes the most difficult trials revealed the truest measure of what someone was willing to fight for, and she had found, in Duke Alaric Ashford, a man willing to ride for hours without rest, to search a vast and indifferent city for weeks on end, simply for the chance to make things right. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and clear, the last lingering chill of winter giving way at last to the first gentle warmth of early spring. Alina stood in a quiet upstairs room at Ashford Manor, watching sunlight spill across the wooden floor while a maid carefully arranged the final touches of her gown, a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, yet one that carried echoes of the careful, patient needlework she had practiced for months in Margaret's small shop. She had insisted, against the gentle protests of the household staff, that Margaret herself be given the honor of assisting with the final alterations to her wedding gown, a gesture that meant more to both women than words could easily express. Margaret had traveled from the city 2 days earlier, staying as an honored guest within the very walls that had once seemed impossibly distant from the humble shop where she and Alina had built their quiet, steady friendship. Alina caught her own reflection in the tall mirror standing near the window, and for a moment hardly recognized the woman looking back at her. Gone was the frightened, soaked figure who had once stumbled away from these very gates with nothing but a small bag and a shattered sense of belonging. In her place stood someone whose eyes held a quiet, steady confidence, someone who had faced betrayal and uncertainty, and had chosen, in the end, to trust in a love that had proven itself worthy of that trust through weeks of relentless searching and genuine sacrifice. Priscilla arrived just as the maid finished her final adjustments, carrying with her a small, carefully wrapped box that she presented to Alina with an expression of nervous hope. Inside, Alina found a delicate string of pearls that had belonged to Alaric and Priscilla's late mother, a family heirloom Priscilla explained had been intended for whichever woman eventually became the next Duchess of Ashford. She said, her voice unsteady with emotion, that she could think of no one more deserving of wearing them than the woman who had shown her brother, and in many ways herself, the true meaning of forgiveness and resilience. Alina, moved beyond words by the gesture, embraced Priscilla warmly, the last remaining traces of tension between them finally dissolving into something that, while perhaps not quite friendship, had grown into genuine mutual respect and care. Priscilla helped fasten the pearls carefully around Alina's neck, and for a moment the two women simply stood together, looking at Alina's reflection in the mirror, both aware of how far they had traveled from the bitter confrontation that had once defined their relationship. Downstairs, in the manor's grand entrance hall, Alaric waited with a nervousness that surprised even him, given how many times over the past months he had imagined this exact moment. He had faced countless difficult negotiations and decisions in his role managing the estate, yet nothing had ever made his hands tremble quite the way they did now, waiting for the doors to open and reveal the woman he had searched an entire city to find. The garden had been chosen for the ceremony itself, the same quiet space where Alina and Alaric had first discovered their connection during those stolen evening conversations months earlier. The roses that had bloomed even through the cooler autumn months now flourished fully in the fresh spring warmth, their fragrance mixing with the soft murmur of gathered guests, a modest but heartfelt collection of household staff, distant family, and the few close friends who had supported Alaric throughout his long, determined search. Margaret sat near the front, dressed in her finest gown, watching with visible pride as Alina made her way slowly down the garden path toward the small gathering. Alina's eyes found Alaric's the moment she stepped into view, and every lingering trace of nervousness dissolved entirely at the sight of his expression, open and unguarded, filled with a joy that mirrored exactly what she felt building steadily in her own chest. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by the local clergyman who had known the Ashford family for decades, his words carrying the weight of tradition, softened by genuine warmth for the couple standing before him. When it came time for the exchange of vows, Alaric spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes, promising not only his loyalty and protection as her husband, but his continued effort, every single day, to be worthy of the trust she had chosen to place in him after everything that had happened. Alina, when her turn came, found her own voice steadier than she expected, speaking words that came not from careful rehearsal, but from the genuine depth of feeling that had grown between them through weeks of separation and searching. She promised him her partnership, her honesty, and her unwavering support, acknowledging openly before the gathered witnesses that she had once believed herself unworthy of the very future now unfolding before her, and thanking him, in front of everyone present, for never allowing her to believe that lie for longer than circumstances forced upon her. When the clergyman finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted into warm, genuine applause, and Alaric, without waiting for any further formality, pulled Alina into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any spoken vow of exactly how completely he had committed himself to their shared future. The celebration that followed carried long into the evening. The manor's usually formal dining hall transformed for the occasion into a warm, welcoming space, filled with laughter and conversation that stretched across every level of the household, staff and family mingling together, in a way that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. Alina moved through the gathering with an ease that surprised her, greeting guests, and accepting congratulations with a confidence that had grown steadily since that terrible, rain-soaked afternoon when her entire world had seemed to collapse. Late in the evening, when the celebration had begun to quiet, and many of the guests had retired for the night, Alina found herself standing once again in the garden, beneath the same stars that had witnessed the very first conversation between herself and Alaric so many months earlier. He found her there, exactly as she had known he would, and wrapped his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head as they both looked up at the clear night sky. She told him, her voice soft in the quiet evening air, that she had once believed this exact garden marked the ending of everything she thought she understood about her place in the world. He tightened his arms around her gently and told her that instead, it had marked nothing less than the true beginning, the first quiet moment in a story that would carry them forward through whatever challenges and joys still waited ahead, together, exactly as it was always meant to be. 2 years passed, and Ashford Manor had changed in ways few could have predicted on that stormy afternoon, when Alina had once been cast out through its gates. The garden still bloomed each spring with the same roses that had witnessed her first quiet conversations with Alaric, but the household itself now carried a warmth that had been noticeably absent during the years before her arrival, a warmth that visitors often remarked upon without quite understanding its source. Alina had taken to her role as Duchess with a steadiness that surprised even those who had known her longest. She used her position to establish a small workshop within the town nearest the estate, offering training and honest employment to young women who found themselves, as she once had, without family support or easy prospects. She often thought of Margaret during these efforts, remembering the quiet kindness that had given her shelter and purpose during her most desperate weeks, and she made certain that same kindness extended outward to others facing similar circumstances. Margaret herself visited the manor often, her small dress shop having grown considerably under Alina's continued patronage, and the steady stream of new customers drawn by association with the Duchess herself. The two women's friendship, forged in the quiet back room of a modest shop between a bakery and a bookseller, remained as steady and genuine as it had been during those uncertain early days, unaffected by the change in Alina's circumstances or title. Priscilla, too, had found her own path forward during those 2 years. The genuine remorse she had shown in the aftermath of her brother's confrontation had grown, over time, into real transformation. She had taken an active role in supporting Alina's workshop initiative, using her own social connections to secure fair contracts and steady work for the women it trained. And the relationship between the two sisters-in-law had grown, slowly but genuinely, into real friendship. Built on the foundation of honesty, they had both worked hard to establish in the difficult months following Alina's dismissal. Alaric, watching his wife move confidently through a life that had once seemed entirely uncertain to her, often found himself reflecting on how close he had come to losing her entirely, how easily a coach departing on schedule from a busy city station might have carried her away permanently if he had arrived at that waypost in only minutes later than he did. He never took for granted the fragile, uncertain chain of events that had ultimately brought them together, and he made a quiet habit, every year on the anniversary of that desperate ride north, of taking Alina back to that same modest Waypost Inn, sharing a simple meal together in the same small dining room where they had first begun rebuilding the trust that had been so nearly destroyed. Their household grew in time to include 2 young children, a daughter with her mother's steady, thoughtful eyes, and a son who had inherited his father's quiet determination. Alina often told them, as they grew old enough to understand, a gentler version of the story of how their parents had found their way to each other, emphasizing not the pain of betrayal and separation, but the enduring lesson that genuine love, when tested honestly, could survive even the most difficult circumstances. She never fully forgot the fear and humiliation of that rain-soaked afternoon, when she had been pushed out through the manor's side door with nothing but a small bag and a shattered sense of who she was. But she came to understand, over the years that followed, that the woman who had walked away from those gates that day, alone and uncertain, had carried within her exactly the strength and resilience needed to eventually walk back through them as their rightful mistress, chosen not for her family name or her fortune, but for the simple, enduring truth of who she was. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and the children had long since been put to bed, Alina and Alaric often found themselves back in the garden where it had all begun, watching the same stars that had witnessed their earliest, tentative conversations all those years before. It was there, more than anywhere else within the vast manor's many rooms, that Alina felt most fully herself, most fully certain of the life she had built, piece by careful piece, from the wreckage of a single devastating afternoon. She had left that garden once with nothing but a shattered heart, believing her connection to this place, and to the man who ruled it had ended forever. Instead, she had discovered that some stories, however painful their beginnings, were simply waiting for the right moment to reveal their true and lasting ending, and hers had ended exactly as it was always meant to, standing beside the Duke who had never once stopped searching for her, in the garden where their story had truly begun.